program, interview with Professor George Lenczowski, November 30th, 1984, Berkeley, California. Tape interviewer G.R. Afkhami, tape 1, face 1. Professor Lenczowski, would you kindly tell us something about your own background, where you were born, how did you come into contact with Iran, what in Iran in fact seemed interesting to you, attracted you, anything that seems to be of interest to yourself in this preliminary way?
Well, I'm a Polish-born person. I have studied in Poland, France, and England. My formal degrees are in law. I collected 3 degrees in law and have a doctorate in law from France. I entered as a young man the Polish Foreign Service and asked for assignment in the Middle East. Initially it was not in Iran. Then soon after I joined the Foreign Service, the war broke out. Then I joined the military and participated in the campaign of the Middle East and North Africa against the Axis. I was an officer in the Polish forces that were under British command. But at a certain point in 1942, I was transferred from the military back to the diplomatic service of the Polish government, which was then in exile in London, as many other allied governments whose countries were occupied by the Axis powers. There was a Polish embassy in Tehran, and I was appointed press attaché with the rank of first secretary. My job was essentially very political, and it put me in touch with many political personalities in Iran. Then the war ended, the Yalta Agreement was concluded, which determined the fate of Poland, and I decided not to return to Poland, but to come to the United States. Because I had higher academic degrees, I was qualified to teach, and I embarked upon an academic career that brought me within a few preliminary years of teaching in the east of the United States to California. I have been at the University of California since 1952. And I established myself as a specialist on Middle Eastern politics. I was always fascinated by the Middle East, and I may add that I had actually altogether 3 experiences in the Middle East. I was stationed once in the British Mandate of Palestine. Then I had the military service that ranged from Libya through Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, up to Iraq, and eventually I resumed the diplomatic service in Iran. In Iran, during the war, I was stationed between 42 and 45. These were very eventful years in which I came intimately into contact with the Iranian political process. And this served me in good stead, because later, as an academic in the United States, I was able to resume my direct contacts with Iran by traveling frequently. And in fact, from 1955 on, I never missed a year in traveling to Iran. Every year, I would go to the Middle East to make a round trip that included usually Lebanon, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf, very often Iraq and Syria, and invariably Iran. During the visits in Iran, I would see a great range of people. I would see political leaders, academic leaders, journalistic leaders, many of whom I knew from my earlier days as press attaché. I knew, for example, Abbas Massoudi and his brother Javad Massoudi, and my especially good friend was Dr. Mustafa Mezbazadeh, and a number of other people. I knew leaders of various political parties, of whom many were in existence during the war. And I established also pretty close relations with the royal court, which led me into a number of audiences with Shah Mohammad Reza Shah. I think that during those years I must have been received between 20 and 25 times by the Shah, and in this sense I think that I was one of the few unofficial Americans, that is those who did not serve in any diplomatic capacity, who saw Iran as frequently, so frequently. In fact, I believe that perhaps only among those Americans whom I know and who had close contact with Iran, only Kermit Roosevelt might have been seeing the Shah more often than I did. And eventually there was first, I would say, a degree of perhaps probing. The Shah knew about my background and about the fact that I was teaching about Iran and Middle Eastern subjects, but perhaps he still did not fully trust me initially. So our conversations initially were, I would say, on more formal side.
Still does it, Lenczowski, when you say initially, you are referring to what years now?
1950s. From mid-1950 to 1960 or so. Later, however, the Shah became, so to say, accustomed to me, and I think became convinced that I am genuinely a friend of Iran, that I am motivated by the desire to see the Iranian and American relations flourish, follow a friendly course, and that I was wishing the best for Iran in terms of its security, in terms of its development, and that I had basically a positive attitude towards the Pahlavi regime, which I did and which I still continue to have now, because I consider the Pahlavi regime as the regime of modernization and as a regime in which both rulers, I believe, had proper priorities in foreign policy. Now, on this larger issue, I may say I like to compare three persons. I like to compare Mossadegh, the Shah, I mean Mohammad Reza Shah, and Khomeini. Each of them selected one country that was the greatest danger to Iran's survival. Mossadegh claimed that it was Great Britain. Had he done this perhaps a century earlier, if he were alive at that time, maybe he might have been right, but even then it might have been dubious. Anyway, at the time when Mossadegh appeared as prime minister on the scene, Britain was already a tired lion, relinquishing her imperial control, and to focus on India.
But would you like to take from that?
Yes, well, the relationship later, of course, changed completely because, first of all, Grédy disappeared from the scene, was replaced by other ambassadors, and I would say that there was no question that any other American ambassador would take this patronizing attitude towards the Shah. On the contrary, the ambassadors became very conscious of the fact that the Shah was a powerful person and that they should treat him with all due respect as a sovereign of an important, strategically important country and a friend of the United States. I would say that the apogee of this attitude among American ambassadors was reached under the ambassadorship of Ambassador MacArthur, who not only was very respectful towards the Shah, but who even, I would say, exaggerated a little bit by being perhaps a little obsequious even, in the sense that he never registered any, at least in the conversations with such people as myself or other visitors that I know visited him and talked to him about the Shah, he never registered any dissent from anything that the Shah would say. He acted almost as the Shah's spokesman, which struck some Americans as a slight exaggeration.
Let me interject here for a moment. There was a rumor in Iran that you yourself might become American ambassador to Iran. Is there anything to it?
Well,
at about the same time that Ambassador MacArthur...
These rumors were flying here and there, and the fact is that under the Nixon and then Ford administration, I was offered twice certain federal positions. One was to become a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Nixon administration, a job that was taken eventually by my former student Robert Pranger on my recommendation, because I was at that time too committed to certain other projects to be able to take this job. And another, under the Ford administration in the early days, I was offered a job of the head of social sciences section of the American delegation to UNESCO, possibly with the rank of ambassador, that I don't know. And again, it required a lengthy stay in Paris, for which I was not prepared, and I was not terribly anxious to go to Paris because I visit Paris anyway every year. So the glamour of being in Paris was not so great, and I did not think that the job in UNESCO was challenging or important enough, so I refused it. But that was the degree of my involvement or possible involvement with the federal government. And as regards the Iranian thing, there might have been rumors, but I was never formally approached regarding this matter. Well, to return now to the position of the Shah, I would say that particularly from 1963 on, that is the launching of the White Revolution, the Shah gained greatly in self-assurance. And really, when you talked to him, you felt that he knew what his program was. He has crystallized in a way his ideology, his program, and he was very confident in himself. In the mid-70s, particularly in connection with the oil crisis and certain other crises in the Middle East, I would say that the Shah displayed not only supreme self-confidence, but even perhaps a degree, shall I say, of assertiveness of this type, that he would be inclined almost to preach or sermonize to the visitors who visited him, pointing out to the mistakes that certain Western governments are making, whether it is in the field of energy or in some other policies. And some critics at that time would call it perhaps even arrogance on his part, because here was a leader of a medium-sized country, not a superpower, who was trying to, in a way, to teach and preach to the leaders of the great powers of the West. And that perhaps rubbed some Western newspapermen the wrong way. I understood that situation very well, and I never had actually any unpleasant moment, I would say. In fact, as the time went on, my relationship with the Shah became more personal and more cordial.
Let me ask you a question in connection with what you were just saying. In fact, there are two sides to this. One is the sort of line that is being propagated by the left, really, communists of various sorts, leftists of various sorts, that tends to depict the Shah as an American stooge, that he did whatever the Americans or the United States government wanted him to do. That's one side. The other side is the statements made by people like, let's say, Secretary Simon and others that all the time said that he, meaning the Shah, seemed to suffer from delusions of grandeur, that he had become a megalomaniac, or intimations of that sort. Now, not always in the same way. Now, you knowing him, and knowing Iran, and knowing the United States, and also the other side, how do you see this? How do you react to it?
Well, first of all, I absolutely reject the thesis that he was an American stooge. I think that the Shah was a real and very genuine Iranian nationalist, not of negative Mossadegh type, but in the tradition of his father, who wanted to assert Iran's sovereignty and independence, who wanted to unite the country, build the nation, build the state. So he looked upon the United States as a very important factor in defending, in protecting Iran against the ever-present Soviet danger and communist danger, but no more than that, it seems to me. And he had moments of disagreement with the United States. Certainly it was demonstrated in the early 60s when he made certain arrangements with the Soviet Union to buy Soviet arms, and when he did not fully agree with the United States on a number of issues, for example, on the American approach to Pakistan, particularly during the Pakistan-Indian War. The Shah was a man of an independent judgment, but realistic enough to know that in this world dominated by the two superpowers, he had to make a certain choice. In other words, he did not quite believe in official neutrality and de facto neutrality, even although in the later stages of his reign he would call the Iranian policy an independent Iranian policy. But I think that at the bottom of the heart he always realized that if he lost the American friendship or American interest in the survival of Iran, he would be digging a grave under Iran, that Iran needed sort of an alliance relationship, as does Western Europe, after all. This does not mean that Mrs. Thatcher is our stooge, or that Helmut Kohl in Germany is a stooge, or Mr. Mitterrand, but all of these people appreciate simply the reality of American power in protecting them from Soviet onslaught.
Did you ever talk to him personally in your meetings with him? Did you ever talk to him personally about these matters, about
well, I talked about a number of issues, really, in these 20-25 audiences that I had with him, and I am actually reluctant even to call them audiences because it sounds too formal. It's good for an ambassador. I was a private citizen. I was a professor and writer. I had conversations simply with him, and I would say these conversations were probably franker than those that he had with ambassadors, because the ambassadors are under constraints of official instructions. They cannot ask certain questions that may be embarrassing to them or to the Shah. I had no constraints whatsoever. I only had to watch in order not to irritate him. We were sometimes frank, and I'm afraid that on one or two occasions I might have overstepped the boundaries and asked a question that annoyed him somewhat, but only it proved the kind of a frank relationship that we have both developed, to use the French expression, toute proportion gardée, because he was a ruler and I was just a private commoner from another country. But now to move to this other thing, namely whether he was developing megalomania or whatever, and that Simon, as you know, used rather some abusive words, our Secretary of Treasury at that time. I would say this, that certainly with the growth of self-confidence and the tremendous influx of oil money and fantastic development in the third and fourth 5-year plan, plus the throwing of his weight in the Persian Gulf and in Oman, the Shah perhaps could be excused for developing certain overconfidence and adopting sometimes this sermonizing kind of attitude towards other powers or Western powers. Well, some people may call it megalomania, maybe it's an exaggeration, but certainly let's remember one thing, that after all he was a ruler, you know, in an authoritarian country. I don't like to call him a dictator. He was not. There is a difference between a king and dictator. But he was an authoritarian ruler, certainly, ruling by other methods than his father and paving the way still for other methods for his son. But nevertheless, it was essentially an authoritarian system. And in authoritarian system, you just don't tolerate dissent, number one. And number two, you are in a way gradually, because of the nature of authoritarianism, becoming insulated from other influences and possibly criticism. So what was possible in the 1960s, for example, when Hussein Allah and some other leaders visited him and asked him, for example, not to take too violent measures against the opposition that waged an onslaught on him because of the agrarian reform in 1962. Now these elder statesmen could still visit him and tell him these things. To be sure, they paid a penalty for this because they were never later invited to serve in high positions. So the others learned, and the others were more careful to warn him or criticize him. So this way he was becoming gradually more and more insulated from criticism, from dissent. And that, of course, might have affected his general attitudes. Well, some people were calling it megalomania. I think it's too hard a word, but certainly there was perhaps an overflow of self-confidence at one time or another. But this only shows that he was far from that definition of being an American stooge or anybody else's stooge.
When you talked to him, I presume you talked also about America, United States politics.
True.
Did you get a feeling that he does know, he understands the intricacies of American domestic politics and its effect on American foreign policy?
Definitely. I think that he understood it very well. He understood the American political process. And in fact, more than once, we discussed the dilemma of one or another American president and in the American president's relationship with the Senate and Congress of the United States. For example, there were the problems of armaments, the problems of oil, and so on and so forth, and the problem of general American commitment to one or another type of political action or alliance. The Shah, I think, understood all of this very well, to the extent that he would discuss even with me the nature of certain political personalities in the United States. He was watching, he was a good observer. He knew who was standing for what among the leaders of American Senate, or even what were the slight nuances and differences among the attitudes of American cabinet members. I was very much impressed by his knowledge. He was a very well-informed person. And that brings me perhaps to another part of your fundamental question, namely you were first asking about the Shah on a comparative scale between the earlier parts of his reign and the later, and then on a comparative scale about other leaders in the Middle East. Well, I have been fortunate to get acquainted with most of the leaders of the Middle East over the years at one time or another. For example, in Saudi Arabia, I was a personal guest, even at meals, of at least 3 times, if not 4, of King Said. Then I was a personal guest in Taif of King Faisal. And then I got acquainted with King Khaled and the present King Fateh. When he was Minister of Education, came to Berkeley and sat in my class in order to listen how I lecture, although his English is not too good. So this gives you a certain idea of my exposure to the Saudi establishment. And I'm speaking just of the rulers, not to speak of many other people around them who I knew rather well. Well, I met Nasser, I met Fikri al-Kuwatli, President of Syria. I met King Hussein a number of times, and the Crown Prince Hassan, and President Shamoun of Lebanon, and a number of Iraqi leaders like Regent Abdul Ilah in the good old Nuri days, and Abdul Karim Qasem, with whom I had an interview at the time of the Kuwait crisis, and Abdul Salam Arif, Abdul Salam Jalil, the Prime Minister of Libya, to give you a certain range of my exposure to the leaders of the Middle East. And I would say that among all of these leaders, I would range the Shah as the most intelligent of them, and the best informed in a rational way about international politics, strategy, and the American political process. I think he stood higher in his intelligence with Nasser, although there are many good things to be said about Nasser too. He didn't, however, one thing we must acknowledge: the Shah did not have the charisma, the way his father had. His father was a powerful father figure. The Shah, no matter what he tried to do in terms of public relations, did not somehow manage to achieve that appeal to the wide masses. He was never really, it seems to me, popular, either with the masses of his people or with foreigners. They might have respected him or feared him, but it was not the kind of appeal that his father had or Nasser had. For example, I had a conversation with Nasser over the crisis in Yemen, in which we exchanged very controversial views that we disagreed with each other. But Nasser, even although he was talking nonsense according to my criteria, did it in a very charming way, was laughing, and you could sense how this man has a magnetic kind of influence upon the Egyptian masses. I don't think the Shah ever had that.
Well, do you think that he was, or let me put this another way, a more neutral way? How do you think he fared in this line with foreign leaders, let's say with American leaders? Did they seem to like him, or did they tolerate him, or did they seem to respect him, or have him as an ally, or something?
Well, because I was never an insider in the American administration, I cannot really say what they really thought of the Shah. I have a feeling that perhaps President Carter might have had a little, I don't know, almost inferiority complex vis-a-vis the Shah, and this is because the Shah had already been on the throne over 30 years and who had such a tremendous wide exposure to world affairs and to world leaders, and here was the President of the United States, formerly a small businessman, owner of a warehouse, peanut business, and catapulted into the presidency. So I cannot say, maybe I'm unjust to Carter even in saying this, but I do not feel that I have a proper ground to say anything about this. Although I do believe that he was respected by all American presidents, because he made a point that whenever a new American president appeared on the scene, he would visit him in Washington and expect a revisit in Tehran. And these visits of the Shah were for the purpose of both explain the general international situation and from the Shah's point of view, gauging how much he can count on the United States unserving as a kind of an ultimate guarantor of Iranian survival in terms of armament, in terms of cooperation in economic matters, and so on.
A little bit interesting question on the other side. You, in fact, talked personally to the chair, I suppose, since the Eisenhower administration, that is already understanding, until the end. And did you ever have occasion to gauge his assessment of the American leader? So how is the access to it?
Not easy to say. I think that implicitly he had a great respect for the Eisenhower administration. Whether he had a personal respect for Eisenhower as a president or as a secretary of State, it's harder for me to say, but after all, it's their determined policy that decided was decisive in showing support of the Shah during the Mossadegh crisis. After all, it was a very decisive moment in his life. I'm not so sure about his reactions to Lyndon Johnson or Kennedy, for example. I'm not sure. I didn't have much evidence. I think that the relationship with Nixon was a good one because this corresponded to the Nixon doctrine, which said that we are not going to overextend, we Americans are not going to overextend our military responsibilities over the world. We are going to help those who want to help themselves and arm them if they wish. So, and indeed, under the Nixon administration, almost a carte blanche was given to Iran to acquire any sophisticated American weapons. So, this was a pretty good record. In the Nixon established a good relationship.
Well, let me just continue this line for one more text. In terms of his understanding or his reaction to other regional leaders, you ever got, for example, the talk from him about, how he felt about or that, obviously, in the later, particularly with the Saudis or the other British.
Well, I definitely have impression we discussed these things. The Shah was a decided matter, considering the disturbance and considering matters national claims to exaggerate. In other words, recognize the legitimacy of our nationalism to be sure, but he would not recognize the legitimacy of national revolutionary crusade to meddle in the affairs of other Arab countries, and even beyond that, and try to upset their internal order. Now, his basic policy towards Saudi Arabia was one of friendly cooperation. He wanted Saudi Arabia to be stable, but he realized that the Saudis were somewhat suspicious of Iran in the Gulf region. Furthermore, interestingly enough, the Shah had doubts about Saudi stability. Let's remember that the Shah made several attempts to establish a closer relationship with the Saudis on the basis of Islamic cooperation. Interestingly enough, because he was a secular-minded leader, the Saudis, of course, were not, but natural priests of nationalism. And the Saudis countered it by playing down nationalism and playing up Islam. And therefore, the kings of Saudi Arabia, particularly Faisal, would visit the Shah in Tehran and would expect and get his visit in Saudi Arabia. It's very interesting that about that time, that was in the 1960s, I edited a book under the title The Political Awakening in the Middle East. This was really a book bringing among the views Saudi reform program and reading of Iran and so on. whole concept of the right revolution in its real. Sitting mainly Iran and Saudi Arabia. Because the day was, despite all the differences, also this similarity, that the two regimes were monarchy, they were authoritarian monarchy, and both their own way tried to reform and modernize their country. So these regimes are not another Korean because country they couldn't continue to be solid. Nevertheless, they did go on some occasions to the opinion of the ulama, for example, by allowing the shopkeepers to sell record music. They were taken apart, so we become fundamentally smashing the record. Well, they were these examples of certain mechanisms in modern and culture. During the conversation with the Shah, during Khalifatul, the two writers listed the Iran Saudi Arabia state was one of the two gentlemen I got to know that we have here from this time. He simply is even closer. He takes that he made sort of a social expression of the island. If you wanted to get rid of some Islam, to put on his nose, and made the very gesture, the Khalidi's right to the state. He could not want to say the word that was described